My fiancée insisted on wearing her ex's locket, saying, "It's a part of my history." I said, "History is important." So I made her part of mine. Her jaw dropped when I took back the engagement ring to put it in a family vault. I, 29M, thought I knew everything about my fiancée when she moved in with me 6 months before our wedding. We'd been together for 3 years, and I believed we'd shared all our secrets, all our histories. I was wrong. It started on a Tuesday evening when I came home from work to find her sitting on our bed, holding something small and golden in her hands. She was completely absorbed, turning it over in her fingers like it held the secrets of the universe. When she heard my footsteps, she quickly clasped it around her neck and turned to greet me with that brilliant smile that had captured my heart years ago. The locket was delicate, clearly expensive, and definitely not something I'd ever seen her wear before. When I asked about it, she explained that she'd found it while unpacking some boxes from storage. It had belonged to her ex-boyfriend, the one she'd dated for 2 years before we met. She said it contained a photo of them together from their trip to Italy, and that wearing it made her feel connected to an important part of her past. My stomach dropped. I asked her why she'd want to wear jewelry from another man, especially now that we were engaged. Her response floored me. She insisted that her relationship with her ex was a fundamental part of who she was, and that I should understand the importance of honoring one's history. She said the locket represented growth, lessons learned, and experiences that shaped her into the woman I fell in love with. I tried to explain how uncomfortable it made me feel, how inappropriate it seemed for my future wife to wear another man's jewelry to our dinner dates, to family gatherings, to bed. She accused me of being insecure and controlling, saying that truly confident men don't feel threatened by their partner's past relationships. The argument escalated over the following weeks. She wore that locket everywhere. To my company's holiday party, where my colleagues noticed and made comments. To Sunday dinner with my parents, where my mother's eyebrows raised so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. To our engagement photos, where it caught the light and drew attention away from the ring I'd spent months saving for. When I brought up my concerns again, she doubled down. She said that if I truly loved her, I would accept all parts of her history, including the meaningful relationships that came before me. She claimed that trying to erase her past was a form of emotional manipulation, and that healthy couples should be secure enough to acknowledge previous relationships without jealousy. I started to question myself. Was I being unreasonable? Was this really about my own insecurity? But then I began noticing other things. She'd smile differently when touching the locket. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at it with an expression I couldn't quite read. Once, I saw her take it off and hold it up to the light, whispering something I couldn't make out. The breaking point came 3 weeks before our wedding. We were at the jeweler's for a final fitting on our wedding rings when she mentioned wanting to incorporate the locket into her wedding ensemble somehow. She suggested wearing it as something old, or possibly having the jeweler create a way to attach it to her bouquet. The jeweler, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, looked between us and diplomatically suggested that most brides prefer to wear family heirlooms for such traditions. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, while she was at work, I drove to my family's bank where we kept our safety deposit box. Inside was a collection of jewelry that had been passed down through generations of my family. My grandmother's pearl necklace, which she'd worn to her wedding in 1952. My great-aunt's emerald earrings, gifted to her by her husband after their first son was born. A delicate gold bracelet that had belonged to my great-grandmother, engraved with the date of her golden wedding anniversary. But most importantly, there was my grandmother's engagement ring. The original one, from before my grandfather upgraded to a larger diamond for their 10th anniversary. It was a simple but elegant piece, with a small but perfectly clear diamond set in white gold that had been polished to a mirror shine despite its age. I also retrieved something else from the box, a beautiful vintage jewelry case, lined with deep blue velvet, that had belonged to my great-grandmother. It was designed to hold a complete set of jewelry, with individual compartments for rings, necklaces, earrings, and bracelets. When I got home, I carefully removed my engagement ring from her jewelry box and placed it in the vintage case alongside the other family pieces. Then I sat down at my computer and began researching. I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with. So I spent hours learning about healthy relationship boundaries, the psychology of keeping mementos from past relationships, and the significance of wedding traditions across different cultures. That evening, when she came home, I was waiting in the living room with the jewelry case open on the coffee table. She immediately noticed her ring was missing and asked where it was. I calmly explained that I'd been thinking about her words regarding history and its importance, and that I'd realized she was absolutely right. I told her that history was indeed crucial, and that family history, in particular, held special significance. I gestured to the open case and explained that these pieces represented 5 generations of women in my family, each one a story of love, commitment, and lasting partnership. I described how my great-great-grandmother had worn the pearl necklace to her wedding during the Depression, how my great-grandmother had treasured the gold bracelet through 2 world wars and the loss of 3 children, how my grandmother had passed down not just jewelry, but the values of loyalty, respect, and putting one's spouse above all past relationships. Her face went white as she realized what I was saying. I continued, explaining that since history was so important to her, I wanted to honor my family's history by ensuring that the engagement ring I'd given her was properly preserved alongside these other precious heirlooms. I said that just as she felt it was important to wear symbols of her past relationship, I felt it was important to protect symbols of my family's legacy of successful marriages. She demanded I return her ring immediately, but I remained calm. I explained that the ring was now part of my family's historical collection, safely stored in our bank's vault, where it would be protected for future generations. I told her that when she was ready to fully commit to our relationship and remove the symbol of her commitment to another man, we could discuss the possibility of selecting a new ring together, one that would represent our unique bond rather than competing with tokens from her past. The argument that followed was nuclear. She accused me of stealing her property, of manipulation, of trying to control her through financial pressure. She said I was being petty and vindictive, that I was punishing her for being honest about her past. She threatened to call the police, to call off the wedding, to tell everyone what I'd done. I listened to everything she said and then responded quietly. I reminded her that the ring had been given as a symbol of our commitment and future together, but that she'd made it clear that her past relationship held equal or greater significance in her life. I explained that I couldn't in good conscience give a family heirloom to someone who wasn't fully committed to joining my family and leaving her previous relationships in the past where they belonged. She spent the next hour trying different approaches. First anger, then tears, then attempts at negotiation. She offered to remove the locket if I returned the ring, but I told her it was too late for that. Her actions over the past months had revealed something fundamental about her priorities and values that couldn't be undone with a simple gesture. Over the following days, she tried enlisting support from mutual friends and family members. She called my mother, crying and explaining that I'd taken back the engagement ring over a piece of jewelry that meant nothing romantic to her. My mother, who had noticed the locket and been disturbed by it herself, listened politely and then told her that perhaps she should consider what message she'd been sending by prioritizing another man's gift over her future husband's feelings. She reached out to my sister, hoping for female solidarity, but my sister had an even harsher response. She pointed out that no self-respecting woman would wear jewelry from an ex-boyfriend after getting engaged, and that if the relationship was truly over, there would be no need to maintain such intimate reminders of it. Her own friends were split. Some supported her right to keep mementos from past relationships, while others questioned why she'd choose to wear such a piece during her engagement. Her mother, when she finally heard the full story, was mortified and asked why she'd risk her marriage over a necklace. A week after I'd secured the ring in the vault, she came home with a different approach. She sat me down and admitted that maybe she'd been insensitive to my feelings. She said she was willing to put the locket away and never wear it again if I would return the engagement ring and move forward with our wedding plans. I appreciated her offer, but I explained that the issue had grown beyond just the locket. Her reaction to my reasonable request had revealed something about her character that I needed to fully understand before we could move forward. I told her that someone who truly loved their partner wouldn't need to be forced to remove symbols of previous relationships, and that someone who respected their partner wouldn't have dismissed their concerns so completely. She asked what I wanted from her, what I needed to see to make this right. I told her honestly that I wasn't sure if anything could make it right. The trust had been broken not by the locket itself, but by her complete dismissal of my feelings and her insistence that her connection to her ex-boyfriend was more important than her commitment to our relationship. Update 1. 2 weeks passed in an uncomfortable stalemate. She stopped wearing the locket but made sure I noticed her bare neck constantly, sighing dramatically and touching the spot where it used to rest. She'd make comments about feeling like she was losing herself, that I was forcing her to deny parts of her identity. The manipulation was obvious, but it still wore on me. During this time, I did a lot of thinking about what I really wanted from a marriage. I realized that the locket had simply been the symptom, not the disease. The real problem was that when faced with a choice between her future husband's comfort and a memento from a past relationship, she'd chosen the past without hesitation. When I'd expressed hurt, she'd made me the villain rather than examining her own behavior. I started paying attention to other aspects of our relationship with fresh eyes. I noticed how she'd compare me to her ex in subtle ways. always making sure to mention that he'd been more spontaneous or more adventurous. I realized that she still followed all his social media accounts and would casually mention things he was doing, places he was traveling, promotions he'd received at work. The final straw came when I discovered she'd been texting with him throughout our engagement. Nothing explicitly inappropriate, but regular check-ins that she'd never mentioned to me. When confronted, she said they'd maintained a friendship and that she'd never hidden it from me. She just hadn't specifically mentioned every casual conversation because she didn't think it was important. I asked to see the messages, and she immediately became defensive. She said that going through her phone was a violation of privacy and trust, and that demanding access to her personal communications was controlling behavior. But I noticed she was holding the phone protectively against her chest as she spoke, and her eyes kept darting away from mine. That night, I made my final decision about our relationship. Update 2. I scheduled a meeting at the bank to access the safety deposit box one more time, but not for the reason she was hoping. Instead of retrieving the engagement ring, I placed the wedding bands we'd selected inside the box as well. All the symbols of our planned union were now safely stored alongside my family's collection of successful relationship tokens. When I returned home, I found her waiting in the living room with a determined expression. She announced that she'd made a decision. She was prepared to cut all contact with her ex-boyfriend and give me complete transparency about her communications if I would return the engagement ring and set a new wedding date. I sat down across from her and thanked her for the offer, but explained that it was too late. I told her that over the past month, I'd realized that the woman I'd fallen in love with had been partially a facade. The real her was someone who needed to maintain connections to past relationships, who dismissed her partner's legitimate concerns, who saw manipulation as a reasonable tool for getting her way. She started to protest, but I continued. I explained that a marriage built on ultimatums and forced compliance wasn't what I wanted for my life. I said that the right person for me would never have needed to be convinced to prioritize our relationship over a past one, would never have made me feel unreasonable for having normal boundaries, would never have tried to manipulate me with tears and emotional blackmail when I expressed my needs. Her face went through a series of emotions: disbelief, anger, panic, and finally, a cold calculation that I'd never seen before. She told me that I was making a huge mistake, that I'd never find someone who loved me as much as she did, that I was throwing away 3 years over something trivial. I replied that if 3 years could be destroyed by something trivial, then perhaps those 3 years hadn't been as solid as we'd thought. I suggested that maybe she'd been in love with the idea of marriage and stability rather than with me specifically, and that's why she'd been so reluctant to fully close the door on other options. The conversation ended with her demanding to know what she was supposed to tell people about why the wedding was canceled. I told her she could tell them whatever she wanted, that I'd taken back the ring, that I was controlling and unreasonable, that we'd had irreconcilable differences. I said that people who knew us both would form their own opinions based on their understanding of the situation. She moved out 2 days later. Before leaving, she made one final attempt to retrieve the engagement ring, claiming it had sentimental value beyond its role as an engagement symbol. I reminded her that she'd made similar claims about the locket, and that I was simply applying her own logic. The ring was now part of my history, a symbol of lessons learned and experiences that shaped me into the man I was becoming. Update 3. 6 months have passed since she moved out. The relief I feel has confirmed that I made the right decision. I've had time to reflect on the relationship without the daily stress of conflict and manipulation, and I can see clearly how many red flags I'd overlooked or rationalized away. Through mutual friends, I've learned that she's now dating her ex-boyfriend, the one whose locket she'd been so desperate to keep wearing. Apparently, they reconnected after our breakup and realized they still had feelings for each other. Several people have mentioned this to me with expressions of sympathy, assuming I'd be devastated to learn that my suspicions had been correct. But I'm not devastated. I'm grateful. Grateful that I discovered her true priorities before legally binding myself to someone who saw marriage as a backup plan rather than a primary commitment. Grateful that I trusted my instincts instead of letting myself be convinced that normal relationship boundaries were signs of insecurity. The engagement ring remains in the family vault, waiting for the right person, someone who will understand that joining a family means becoming part of its history rather than competing with it. Someone who will see past relationships as chapters that ended for good reasons, not ongoing stories that need to be regularly revisited. I've started dating again, and the difference is remarkable. When I explain to new partners that I value loyalty and commitment above all else in relationships, they nod in understanding rather than arguing about the importance of maintaining connections to exes. When I mention that I'd prefer they not wear jewelry given to them by previous partners, they either agree immediately or mention that they'd already removed such items out of respect for our relationship. My family has been incredibly supportive throughout this process. My mother told me she'd been concerned about the Locket situation from the moment she'd noticed it, but hadn't wanted to interfere. My sister said she'd known from the beginning that anyone who would wear another man's jewelry to family gatherings wasn't serious about joining our family. The most validating moment came when my grandmother, now 92, asked to hear the whole story. After I finished explaining everything, she nodded slowly and said that in her day, a woman who accepted an engagement ring while still wearing tokens from other suitors would have been considered unsuitable for marriage by any respectable family. She told me that protecting the family's values and traditions was just as important as protecting its jewelry. Looking back, I realized that the locket was never really about history or personal growth or any of the philosophical reasons she gave. It was about keeping her options open, maintaining a connection to someone she wasn't ready to let go of, and testing how much she could get away with in our relationship. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's poor choices, even when they try to frame your boundaries as character flaws. I learned that manipulation often comes disguised as enlightened thinking about relationships and personal freedom. Most importantly, I learned that the right person for me will never make me feel unreasonable for wanting to be their clear first choice. The engagement ring will stay in that vault until I find someone who understands that marriage isn't about managing multiple relationships and competing loyalties. It's about choosing one person and making that choice clear to the entire world, including your own heart.